this is the beginning of the two talks today. I'm very happy to introduce Ozren Pupovac and Jennifer Pitts, who will be acting as his discussant after he presents his talk. I'll say something about Jennifer first. Jennifer is the chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She's the author of two books, Turn of Empire, Princeton University Press, and Boundaries of the International, Harvard University Press. And I think it's Jen's first time in Beirut. We're very glad to have you here, as well as Ozren's first visit, long overdue as well. I think we tried to get him here a couple of times before, but it didn't work. Ozren teaches philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Rijeka, where he heads the Center for Theoretical and Critical Research. His work focuses on contemporary French philosophy, Marxist theories of politics and emancipation, the speculative legacy of German idealism, and particularly with an interest in the question of the subject. He published on Marxist philosophy and the post-Yugoslav political context. He's translated works of Badiou, Rancière, Lazarus, and Althusser into Serbo-Croatian. And since 2008, he runs together with Bruno Besana the Versus Laboratory Research Platform in Zagreb, right? Or is it where is it?
It was a mobile thing between Berlin and...
I see. Okay. Okay, so join me in welcoming Ozren and Jennifer.
So the title of my talk is A Gunshot in the Middle of the Concept, Machiavelli and Althusser. And I stole the title from Stendhal, A Gunshot in the Middle of the Concert. But there's a little bit of resonance, and I'm not going to unpack that actually, but in the background there's a little bit of resonance of what Hegel in his lectures on the history of philosophy remarks about Spinoza being a gunshot philosopher. So Carl Schmitt, in his Der Begriff des Politischen, noted somewhere that Machiavelli is a thinker of defeat, a thinker of the ideological defensive in which we are forced to dwell after a historical experience of defeat, to which we should probably add and the deep uncertainty that defeat causes, where all the recognizable coordinates of the past and its experiences are suspended, while the shapes of the future remain indiscernible, and where tremendous expectations are raised precisely around thought in its capacity to orient or anticipate new forms and new possibilities. Such was namely Machiavelli's Italy in the 16th century, amidst the internal collapse of the political rule of bourgeois republics, the dispersion and powerlessness of city-states, and the general disarray caused by foreign conquests, especially from France and Spain. But is this not also our own situation, as a situation of the historical collapse and the discrediting of the revolutionary doctrine of politics? Is this not today's very moment of the wholesale exhaustion of impulses of emancipatory subversion in thought and in practice, of the breakage of the very bond between radical thinking and the forces of resistance and rebellion? And yet, what is it that defeat really names today? What is it that rears its head in and through it? At the dusk of that political form, of which he was not only a theorist but also a militant, the Revolutionary Communist Party, in the middle of the 70s, Althusser turned to Machiavelli as an ally for a recomposition and reconstitution of radical thinking and acting. In a manuscript entitled Machiavel et nous, Machiavelli and Us, drawn from a series of lectures, and unpublished during his lifetime, he reads Machiavelli as a political contemporary, as both Hegel and Gramsci already had. So as someone addressing us communists or us revolutionaries. In other words, as a living interlocutor of the political and theoretical crisis of Marxism, inviting us to think not only the contours and the causes of its crisis, but also to sketch a thinkable path from within it and beyond it. And however heretical it may be, which is not really the point here, Althusser's reading of Machiavelli is interesting for at least two reasons. First, because it proposes a sketch of a certain radicalism of thought which does not draw from the sentiment of defeat any conclusions mired in resignation or the pessimism of loss, the obscurantism of impossibility. Machiavelli, as a thinker of defeat, is not a thinker of renegation, but he's also not a thinker of utopia. And this is the second reason. There is nothing of expectation or deferral in his thought, no projections, no fictive representations of becoming, no imagining or hoping. The time of politics that Machiavelli entices is not the future, it is the concrete present. The element of his thought is not the general horizon of potentiality, be it explicit or latent, but is the very actuality of the movement of rebellious subjectivity with the rationality of the decision to act here and now. And in fact, Althusser wagers nothing less than that Machiavelli provides a matrix of a renewed optimism of revolutionary thinking and acting, an optimism of the intellect, much more than of will, amidst the very dissolution of the form of the revolutionary party. Although a paradoxical optimism throughout, as it is not expressed through the evidence of the compactness of movement and organization, through the famous fusion of theory and practice, through a victorious subjective orientation. There is no room anymore for a certainty accorded by monumental constructions of history. Machiavellian optimism amounts to nothing more than a principled persistence in the situational necessity of acting, with an acknowledgement of an irreducible contingency of politics, even at the very core of the emancipatory process. A revolutionary optimism neither of substance nor of the subject. For the entire question, which is where the complexity of Althusser's reading resides, is in their evacuation. So, what is that which Althusser calls Machiavelli's theoretical dispositive? Althusser frames his reading, focusing almost exclusively on Il Principe, on the prince, around three central figures. So first, that of force, considered in its materiality, as something surrounding politics and its forms, being especially enmeshed in the enormity of the problem of the state. Second, the second figure, that of the conjuncture, of thinking and acting under the condition of the actual moment, which means under a certain thrownness in the historical and political situation, and not simply in terms of its urgency, but especially with regards to the contingency that it exposes. And lastly, the third figure, that of the void, correlated primarily to political subjectivation, to political capacity itself. So let me briefly sketch the contours of each. First, force, as the very element in and through which Machiavelli thinks politics. What is certainly not at stake here is giving voice to the usual diatribes around the attribute Machiavellian, the political cynicism of rule by any means necessary. Machiavelli's realist methodology, a phrase used by Althusser, concerns something else, a specific materialism of force, which is what provides politics with an inescapable horizon. Force being that which is enmeshed into each political situation, the field conditioning each political transformation through history, the latent logic of each political form, of its variations and mutations. And Machiavelli, Althusser would claim, is not here simply opposing force to ideals, to normativity, to attempts at a rationalization of political forms, to the question of the legitimation of sovereignty or the determination of the ends of politics. He is also opposing, in his intuition of force, he's also opposing force to a specific mechanicism, well, precisely to a certain mechanical understanding of force. However close Machiavelli might have come to it, with enumerating typologies of rules, noting constants and repetitions, singling out cyclical movements in history. For there is no question of determining the general laws of the political field in the sense of an extension of a physicalism of force. For if force comes before each ideality, before the law as form, it also comes before any regularity, before laws. In the end, the question of force amounts to nothing but a reflection on the fact that politics always appears within a set of relations interspersed with antagonisms and oppositions, tensions and impositions, takeovers and reversals, victories and defeats, cooptations and ambushes. In short, a field of relations which are unstable and inconstant, inasmuch as they also present an insurmountable materiality. Before touching on questions of foundation or institution, of massivity, of the bond, politics confronts a materiality of force. Thus, Machiavelli's entire insistence that laws do not suffice, or that armed forces are more important. Thus, the thematization of the diversity of political forms, and especially the law and the state, as something subordinated to a dynamic of forces, as in Machiavelli's celebration of popular militias or the armed people, as an amalgam of lasting political rule or of correctly established laws. Thus, the affirmation of the subjectivity of virtu as a reliance on one's own forces, as an attempt to find a way through unfavorable circumstances. So once again, force is not simply an omnipresent material horizon. Once again, force is simply an omnipresent material horizon of politics. Its inescapable material condition, its limit and its point of resistance, which is how Althusser adds, Machiavelli anticipates concepts of class struggle, domination, and hegemony. And this primacy of force over form is something that precisely concerns the problem of the state. Not simply in the sense of the concentration of an armed repressive force, coercion in the physical sense, but also an ideological force, the force of control and the imposition of rules, the force of persuasion and subjection, and even the very force of form in its existence as a separate instance, whose formal separation in reality presents nothing but a provisional result of the pacification of the clash of forces, which is how Machiavelli, so Althusser suggests, already treats the state, much before Marx or Lenin, as a machine of force, or to quote Althusser, as a machine of the transformation of force into laws. So this very scene of force, or of forces in their multiplicity, in their incessant intertwining and confrontation, already lays out the second figure, that of the conjunction of forces. Althusser says Machiavelli is the first theorist of the conjuncture. For what is crucial here is the angle taken. Machiavelli's approach to force cannot be reduced to a general theoretical reflection, submitting force to a question of the generality of its concepts, figures, forms, movements, dynamics. His entire effort, quite to the contrary, points towards the specific and the singular, towards the conjuncture as a singular conjunction, as a singular joining of elements, towards a dynamic of forces in the actuality of the present moment. So again, from general questions of regularity or coherence, from the distant march of determinations taking shape globally, determining the contours of politics at a distance, we move towards the contingent, the exceptional, and the actual situation as a specific case. And what is more, such a perspective is not a perspective of a mere observer. Machiavelli does not simply reflect on the conjuncture, providing it with the concept of its intelligibility from without. He also, to quote Althusser, thinks in the conjuncture. Althusser would in fact interpret Machiavelli's famous dictum on the verità effettuale della cosa in the following way. This thing is also this case, this task, this singular problem which needs to be posed and solved. A singular problem of the conjuncture in the sense of a concrete political problem to be treated as something stemming from politics itself, as something determined by the historical situation to which politics responds. Let me quote Althusser: "The conjuncture is not a simple collection of its elements, the enumeration of its circumstances, but their contradictory system, which poses a political problem and points towards its historical solution, ipso facto making it a political goal, a practical task." In other words, the perspective of the conflict of forces as a singular case is nothing but the perspective of political action itself, of its actuality, or the perspective of politics, which in the given situation imposes itself as a thinkable necessity. So, before dwelling in the abstraction of a general section of history, Machiavelli's thought is entirely immersed in the actual present to which it responds. Behind the entire conceptual architecture of the prince, behind the typology of forms of rule, the differentiation of specific political maneuvers or technologies, the variations of virtu and fortuna, behind all this there is a concrete problem: thinking the possibility of a response to the political crisis in Italy, amidst the disarray of city-states, amidst disunity and powerlessness. Can there be a political unification of Italy, its constitution as a historical force? Machiavelli's object is at the same time an objective. The objectivity of the knowledge of forces and their confrontation is directed by an injunction of a political task. I quote from Althusser: "All the theoretical elements, as many laws as you like, are arranged in the function of this central political problem, under which form to rally all the positive forces currently at disposal in order to achieve the political goal." So, the question of the conjuncture, of its intelligibility, thus presupposes both how to grasp specific determinations, the dispersion of given forces, the concrete conditions of their expression and activation, the pluralism of circumstances and tendencies, the intertwining of heterogeneous interests or elements. But it also includes seizing the unity of this diverse set, conceiving points of strategic condensation or displacement upon which political possibilities essentially depend. So, besides the problem of a general intelligibility of this heterogeneous set, the conjuncture also signifies an attempt to think a specific political move, a necessary step to take. The concept seems predicated upon an act. It seems to be intimately bonded to its own practical realization. The entire problem here is that Machiavelli's engaged conceptual apparatus is in fact deeply paradoxical, for it is directed at nothing. For what Machiavelli thinks as a necessary political task, a task to be enacted, are not concrete political possibilities, but a fundamental impossibility. The circumstances and conditions which in their plurality and heterogeneity represent the given conjuncture, even if they trace precise points of strategic and tactical movement, concrete tendencies and aspirations of forces, reversals, positionings which might open up paths, all this does not provide a way through. For the very problem of political unification, which Machiavelli attempts to think, is deeply irresolvable from within the horizon of the given constellation of forces, of extant actors and current political forms. There is nothing in the present situation which would provide a positive guarantee of the tendential realization of the task set. Thus, a radical address, a new prince in a new principality. This is the key point. For if the central conceptual apparatus of the prince involves political address, this address pivots upon radical contingency, the utter unpredictability and indeterminacy of a political force which is to respond to it and realize it. Machiavelli calls for a radical beginning, a radical novelty, an invention of a new form and an appearance of a new political force. but he calls for a beginning as a blank space, as the rejection of all extant solutions and all positive forces as possibilities, which also means a beginning in an absence of its objective conditions of possibility. The conceptual apparatus thus assumes a very strange form. For besides grasping the plurality of heterogeneous forces and the mobility of their determination, the concept itself also entails a point of flight, a point of indeterminacy, the necessity of an appearance of a new force which is irreducible to given forces, an empty place for a prince to come. Quoting Althusser, the present space of an analysis of the political conjuncture, in its very texture, comprising opposed and intermingled forces, makes sense only if it arranges or contains a certain place, a certain empty place. Empty in order to be filled, empty so as to have inserted in it the action of the individual or the group who will come and take a stand there, so as to rally, to constitute the forces capable of accomplishing the political task assigned by history, empty for the future. What this means is that we're not dealing here simply with a correlate to that which Lenin would call the problem of the actual moment, thinking under the urgency of the moment, under the injunction of the political act, rendering intelligible and acting upon the current constellation of forces, seizing specific possibilities set out by history in its irreversible unfolding. Machiavelli adds an excess, adds something more, thinking the actuality of that which cannot be determined or named in the present, a new political capacity as an entirely uncertain result of present confrontations. For what is Machiavelli's new prince? In fact, it is neither substance nor the subject, neither potentiality nor certainty, as it is also not a simple question of power. The new prince is an affirmation of a capacity at once necessary and indeterminate. Necessary in the sense of the necessity of a break with everything existent, but indeterminate, for in relation to the objectivity that the concept unfolds, it presents a pure eventual emergence, something appearing at the points of collapse of societal determinations, the collapse of the dynamics of force. So quotes again. The prince is an empty form, a purely aleatory, possible, impossible. No class belonging enables him to assume his historical task. No social bond links him to his people, which he must unite into a nation. Everything depends on his virtu, that is, the subjective condition of his success. And moreover, the indeterminacy is double, as beyond the void of subjectivity, Machiavelli also points towards entirely contingent objective circumstances and indetermination of social objectivity. He speaks of barren places, extreme misery, crisis, of a certain objective vacuum. What is most interesting, however, is how this void is staged within the concept itself, as the tension in its exposition between determination and indeterminacy. In Althusser's quote, in the deployment of disjoint décalage, theoretical notions, the discrepancy between the definite and the indefinite, between the necessary and the unforeseeable. Because on the one hand, there are categories and concepts pretending to universality and necessity. There is the systematicity of a rational discourse. There is the figure of objectivity in its grasp of the situation, clarifying its fundamental elements or forms which dominate the actual confrontation of forces. But on the other hand, there is also the projection within the conceptual apparatus of something which exceeds it, a point of a rupture with objectivity, of something elusive with regards to the present. This central point, quote, where everything is tied up, incessantly avoids detection. For this void within the concept is nothing but the presence of the political real, of the void of the situation itself. Or in Althusser's own words, this discrepancy, thought, but not resolved by thought, is the presence of history and politics in theory itself. In his most intriguing move, Machiavelli therefore stages everything so as to leave a space within the conceptual apparatus for the intrusion of the real of politics itself. Not by determining a radical political solution directly or by concretely anticipating it, not by convoking a political force in the making, a fragile but an existent one, but by affirming the irreducible primacy of politics over its conceptual grasp, the primacy of political action, of the political act, over the activity of the concept. Politics, in other words, presents an irreducible excess over the concept. For, again quote Althusser, a contradiction in reality cannot be removed by thought, but only by reality. It can only be removed by a sudden appearance, necessary but unpredictable and unassignable in terms of place, time, and person, of the concrete forms of a political encounter whose general conditions are only defined. And this excess, and this is the most interesting thing in fact, this excess is in fact properly non-dialectizable, as what is at stake is not to recapture it from within the concept as a form of its completion or realization. There's no inherent negativity as motor. There's no causality of lack at hand, rendering the political act as the very actualization of the activity of the concept. Because in a certain sense, we have come full circle here. The absolute primacy of force over form is precisely the primacy of practice over theory, the irreducibility of the act over the concept. In the end, Machiavelli sets the stage for an entirely different conception of knowledge, or at least a different articulation of the bond between knowledge and action, in the specific link established between conceptual elaboration and political address, an entwining of an effect of knowledge and an effect of political subjectivation, of explication and orientation, of determination and prescription. The issue of temporality is crucial here, because the concept is thus not only something that concerns the past in the sense of explaining a fait accompli, producing an effect of knowledge après coup, as it is also not something that is contemporaneous to politics, in the sense of being co-present to and conditioning a political decision. The concept also includes a staging of something to come, of the inventiveness of political action itself. Knowledge, however, cannot directly create a new present, but it can help open the space for it by projecting its necessity as a necessity of rupture. And this is precisely what makes thought not a representation of reality, but a certain act or a certain activity, an activity of demarcation whose effects are real because they participate in the production of an event of politics, of a new possibility. And this is what Althusser would call Machiavelli's thinking in extremes, to quote Althusser again, to occupy the place of the impossible in order to think the real. Okay, but what are then behind all this, what are Machiavelli's lessons? In which way does Machiavelli touch upon this us, this we, in a situation of the fundamental crisis of the revolutionary doctrine of politics? In a situation where the political present is lacking. The question is, in fact, what does this reading of Machiavelli open up with regard to Althusser's own attempts at grasping politics? And the answer to this is not straightforward, as the implications of the alliance with the Florentine secretary are not immediate. They remain latent. In Althusser's progressive attempt to displace the problem of politics from any perspective of certainty, from any stability which the terrain of social objectivity provides, and to increasingly submit it to the rule of contingency. The entire problem that Althusser starts to address is, in fact, how to think politics after the collapse of the monumental dialectic of fusion fusion of Marxist theory and revolutionary, and the workers' movement. For if, the phrase is from Althusser, from his text on the crisis of Marxism, for if something has snapped, this is precisely the seminal fusion of theory and practice, in the manner in which the doctrine of the Leninist party had canonized it. Without revolutionary theory, no revolutionary movement. Marxism, namely, cannot anymore be considered as the revolutionary doctrine of realization. It cannot anymore be a name for an active thought and practice oriented by the certainty of a victorious doctrine of history. It cannot anymore from within itself capture the real of politics. For not only is there no certainty of the global objectivity of the course of history, but there is no certainty whatsoever of any forms of realization, in the sense of the consistency of reference, of ruptural subjective forces and transformative objective tendencies, which would be essentially carried by Marxist determinations concerning history. Thus, the entire necessity of thinking another type of an articulation between knowledge and action. And thus the attempt at drawing the implications from the idea of an encounter. For it is precisely under the aegis of an encounter of knowledge and action, instead of their fusion, that an effective capture of collective political inventiveness remains possible. An openness towards new political forms of mass creativity. The figure of the encounter, in brief, presupposes an affirmation of the incessant mobility of the determinations of politics as a seizing of their contingency. What this means is that knowledge is not something that determines political movement from without, capturing it in advance as an avant-garde. To the contrary, the concept is not an avant-garde. To the contrary, it essentially encounters it, pivoting upon its immanent intellectuality, embracing the inventiveness of multiple forms of consciousness, of unforeseen or unpredictable political capacities, forms of organization and struggle, tactical or strategic maneuvers. In short, everything that represents the very creativity of mass movement, of acting and resisting in the situation. In a certain sense, we have broken here with everything that Althusser has been so patiently constructing pour Marx, for Marx. We have broken with the very dialectic of the concept, with the entire attempt, via the detour of Spinoza and through a distancing from Hegel, to provide Lenin's theory of the actual moments with a dialectical formalization. For if Althusser had up until now considered, and he has not ceased considering them, the forms of creativity of mass political action and organized militancy, under the rubric of fusion, as these are his own terms, practical inventions, practical works of Marxism, practical forms of the dialectic, moments where political practice stands before theory, or as the very practical existence of theory, with all the implications of the divide between the concept and experience, between objectivity and subjectivity. What steps on stage now is a radical intrusion of politics, the irreducibility of rupture over any theoretical coupure, the cut. And the question is precisely how to think a principled revolutionary engagement without historical certainty. How to frame a political realism of Marxism before reaching for anything of a utopia, but a realism which would not be a realism of realization, but something else. A realism of the contingency of the actual moment, with a discipline of revolutionary responsibility, capable of holding fast to the unpredictable, but without sacrificing, in the openness towards the heterogeneous and the mobile, the principles themselves. A new trajectory of linking collective imagination and organized principality. The implications of this shift in perspective are perhaps mostly visible in Althusser's text from 1978, entitled Le Marxisme comme théorie finie, Marxism as a finite theory. finite as an attribute is not here opposed to the infinitude of the struggle for emancipation, the inexhaustible inventiveness of the revolutionary process, but is in a strict sense the very correlate of Machiavelli's primacy of the act over the concept. For, quoting Althusser, only a finite theory can be truly open towards the contradictory tendencies which it discerns in capitalist society, open towards their aleatory becoming, open towards the unpredictable surprises which have never ceased marking the history of the workers' movement, open, that is, attentive, capable of seriously and timely grasping the incorrigible imagination of history. And just to stop here for a second and think about a bestiary, because we were thinking about beasts in these last days, and we were thinking about Marx's mole, the old mole, as the figure of the dialectic. And here, of course, there's a different beast at play. There's a beast of a sit and wait. There's a beast of being on the lookout. There's a beast of capturing something uncertain rather than being able to dialectically totalize it. I'm not sure which beast I would choose in this sense, whether this, perhaps one of Machiavelli's beasts, the lion or the fox, as kind of a sitting and waiting, maybe a crocodile also camouflaging itself and waiting in order to be on the lookout for something. But I'll leave it open, as Rebecca also left open her bestiary, even if she privileged the mole. Knowledge, as in Machiavelli's Anonymity of the New Prince, stages here a break in the continuity of the concept. It produces a void in the conceptual deployment and determination of its object. It confronts it with something indiscernible and indeterminate, which is effectively a way to position it in the actual present in its very unfolding. The question is precisely how can a concept be actual? What is the actuality of a concept? And it's not a Hegelian actuality, but it's also not a Leninist actuality. It's a certain intertwining between the actuality of an act and an actuality of the concept, which, to unpack it properly, I don't have space here, but it would take us through Spinoza's understanding of the third kind of knowledge. But perhaps we can introduce this in the discussion. For Althusser insists, and this is a brilliant line from Marxism as a finite theory, which I have reflected upon for many years so far. All that theory can say about the future is an extension in dotted lines. The French expression actually is rather ambivalent, en pointillé. And in the negative, so en pointillé, and in the negative of the possibility of an actual tendency, the tendency towards communism. And I would wager that this formulation, in fact, even if poetical, is quite precise, as it points towards two fundamental operators of seizing an intellectuality of a radically open and uncertain political process. A thinkable organization of the consistency of something marked through and through by contingency. These operators are, I would at least name them so, demarcation, and indication. Demarcation, indication. Demarcation as the marking out of limits and limitations in the function of the orientation of politics. This is what Lenin called discerning interests. Razischievati interessi. Negatively, in a determinate sense, to discern the dangers, the ever-present threats of falling back into consensual forms. Ambitious on the terrain of struggle, where the adversary is immensely more powerful. Different forms of recuperation or pacification of radical gestures. Sudden reversals or impasses, and ultimately the deadly threat of the identification of the revolutionary trajectory with the state, even at the core of the revolutionary process. But demarcation also in the sense of something affirmative in and through negation. The clearing of space for an affirmation of an immanent strength as a rejection of all the givens of the extant order of domination in the function of a deployment of an immanent capacity. In other words, the discerning of the very autonomy of the revolutionary trajectory, however fragile and uncertain, however exposed to the essentially aleatory character of its deployment it may be. And I think this is, in fact, a key moment. I think Althusser is fundamentally a thinker of immanence. A thinker of immanence in the sense, perhaps we can translate it, but you actually said it somewhere in Abrégé de Métapolitique, that the fundamental orientation vis-à-vis politics of Althusser is that what counts at the end is our own strength, and not the strength of circumstances, not the strength of the adversary. And this is a profoundly Spinozist intuition. But again, I don't have space or time to elaborate on that. So this is demarcation. Indication, in the sense of directing thought and action towards everything that comes, rendering thought and action open towards new, yet indiscernible forces and capacities, towards mass inventiveness. For besides autonomy, or precisely in the function of autonomy, the question is also the question of exceptions, of being on the lookout, standing and waiting, like our beast, for all things unpredictable. Not only unexpected displacements and fusions, where an irreversible chance or an opening might emerge amidst the plural tendencies and heterogeneous movements, the Leninist kairos of the decisive moment, but also towards all possibles, which in the current order of domination, in its objectivity, seem essentially impossible. The question is how to direct thoughts not only towards the incessant mobility of determinations, but towards everything which appears only en pointillé, through a breakage of conceptual discernibility and intelligibility, as something unclear, as something which remains indeterminate, as a break in the concept, as something belonging to the irreducible register of the excess of the act. So to quote Althusser again, only in the course of struggle can possible forms see the light of day and come to the order of the day, can be discovered and become a reality. But what is it that happens with principles then? What is it that happens with Marxism as a theoretical horizon? What is it that happens with the very general determinations through which knowledge attempts to grasp the unfolding of politics and political movement? What happens with the generality of figures such as class struggle, the hypothesis on the revolutionary process as an end of domination, that is, as the destruction of the state or the withering away of the state, the dictatorship of the proletariat? The entire complexity of Althusser's endeavor is in the specific linkage of such conceptually principled moments and everything situationally contingent, at once in their encounter. For example, the very concept of class under this idea of demarcation and indication, within what Althusser would call the practical materialism of the concrete analysis of the concrete situation, practical materialism of the concrete analysis of the concrete situation, does not anymore represent a point of stability and compactness, the certainty of an objective determination, but concerns precisely indetermination, not simply over-determination. I know I'm putting very complex Althusserian concepts here in a very condensed form. So not simply over-determination in the sense of a constant mobility of determinations, shifting positions and determinacies, but the affirmation of an inexhaustible rupture, a radical indeterminacy, brought about by inventions of mass politics itself. I'm coming towards concluding or ending. With this entire Machiavellian inspiration, Althusser ultimately comes close to affirming that politics is something encountered, something belonging to the order of the event, something conceived through the register of rupture and excess, and not through figures of massivity, gathering, or the bond, or of place. Politics is ultimately a specific, albeit uncertain process, a process without a subject, famously, but means a process of transformation or a practice of transformation exposed to surprises and unpredictability, to the aleatory and the unforeseeable, where the fundamental problem is how to capture the inescapable contingency of its unfolding, whilst keeping hold of the consistency and unity of its process. How to affirm the creative and liberatory forces of collective political discovery without a conceptual capitulation in front of the multiple and the heterogeneous. And in a different work called Que faire? What is to be done, which is an unpublished manuscript also from late 70s, recently published by Presse Universitaire, and also translated into English. Althusser there reflects mostly on he criticizes Gramsci, and he reflects on the relationship between Lenin and Gramsci. But there are also some interesting remarks about Machiavelli. And he says, the prince is not a subject. The prince, it is not a point of synthesis. The prince is a political strategy in the sense of a process without a subject. And I would really read at this stage what Althusser means by process without a subject in terms of this encounter between knowledge and the political act, the irreducibility of the act over the concept. This trajectory of Althusser, singular and fruitful, even if expressed only in traces of conceptual moves and dislocations, remains of course fundamentally incomplete, as well as burdened by a fundamental sense of collapse. But this does not mean that it had exhausted all its effects, or that it had stated all the lessons that it has towards the present, towards our present. What is most interesting, in fact, is that Althusser would discover in Machiavelli, at a central place, the figure of the manifesto, proclaiming the prince as a text, itself a political manifesto. Gramsci did that before, but Althusser has a more subtle reading. As if he wants to point us back to that initial scene of an encounter, the scene of the Communist Manifesto, the scene of the capture in thought, to refer to Hegel, of all the singular forms of rebellious subjectivity, radical as they were unpredictable. The scene, moreover, where the concept itself is intimately fused with a slogan. And perhaps this is a path which we could investigate further, to once again assume a steadfastness of emancipatory thought and practice as that which unified, which remains thoroughly devoted to actuality, as well as directed towards a responsibility dictated by the break which it attempts to discern in it. Perhaps this is a way of how to assume today that which someone else had called an uninhabitable place of a Marxist heterodoxy to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Azrin for this beautiful paper, and thank you to Nadia for the invitation to engage with it. It's incredibly rich and generative, and I'm just going to pose a few questions and look forward to the larger conversation. So I was first really struck by the alignment of the paper's preoccupations with the themes of the project more broadly. It's just a really beautiful coming together of preoccupations from many of the main players in this collaborative project. So the paper invites us to see both Althusser and Machiavelli as living interlocutors for our own conjuncture, whether we think of this as an impasse, whether we think of it as the exhaustion of the emancipatory aspirations of post-socialist and post-colonial movements amid a relentlessly imperial capitalist global order. This is our moment, and just as Althusser is thinking with Machiavelli in his moment, Azrin is bringing both Althusser and Machiavelli as living interlocutors for us. So I loved that about the paper. He turns to Machiavelli to help think our way out of a kind of, Althusser turns to Machiavelli to help think his way out of a kind of political analysis that is wedded to a vision of history as progressive, predictable, or even intelligible. Machiavelli is, he writes, an aleatory materialist. It's a word that Osrin mentioned a few times and that I was very struck by in reading the text. And I'm grateful to Osrin for the opportunity to read Althusser on Machiavelli, which was new to me. So Machiavelli is an aleatory materialist, someone who recognizes that political action is singular, attuned to a particular conjuncture, particular, as Osrin says, not only in its urgency, but also its contingency. The essay, Machiavelli and Us, is a deeply perceptive reading of Machiavelli, I think both because it's faithful to Machiavelli's own concerns, to Machiavelli's problem space, to use David Scott's language, and partly to the contrary because Althusser so explicitly brings his own preoccupations and theoretical apparatus to bear on this text from a very different historical conjuncture than his own. And one feature of that difference is that for Machiavelli, a view of history as progressive was not merely not taken for granted, it wasn't even on the table as a way of thinking. And so it's, that alterity is really productive for Althusser and for us. So Althusser turns to Machiavelli precisely because prior Marxist convictions about an emancipatory historical trajectory feel exhausted. But he himself, I think, still works with a sense of historical development, with a kind of grand historical narrative. That is, he characterizes Machiavelli as grasping that the political demand of his moment, of Machiavelli's moment, was the creation of an absolutist national state, Althusser says, out of a dying feudal order. So while he admires the aleatory in Machiavelli, it seems to me he doesn't fully inhabit that perspective himself. And I wonder what you make of this perhaps uneasy but also productive cohabitation in Althusser of the historicist and the aleatory. Osrin quite dazzlingly, I think, draws from the text three themes, which he calls force, the conjuncture, and the void. And I wanted to pose a question related to each of those. So first on force. As you've said, force conveys that for Machiavelli, politics always appears within a set of unstable relations, antagonisms, tensions. And on that point, I wanted to ask about a related theme that's central to both Althusser and Machiavelli, but rather muted in your paper, which has to do with the figure of the revolutionary leader, the prince as a subject. So you said toward the end that the new prince is a process without a subject. And I'd love to hear you expand on that, because certainly in Machiavelli, but I think also in Althusser, the new prince as a subject, as an individual actor, is a very prominent figure. And I wonder how we might want to think about the distinctive role of leaders in relation to broader social movements. Althusser reads Machiavelli's famous advice that the prince should try to be feared but not hated, as a reflection on the kind of friendship with the people that is necessary to make a durable state that the new prince found. So the new prince as a singular individual is necessary in the founding moment, but to make the state durable, he has to turn that founding into a friendship with the people. So this question of leadership and the relation between leaders and people seems important to them and less to you, and so I'd love to hear what you think about that. Second, on the conjuncture, which is a wonderful idea in Althusser, and you do wonderful things with it. It's a singular case, as Althusser says, an aleatory singular case. It's not a moment in a historical progression. And here Rebecca's beautiful discussion of analogy the other day really resonated for me. Althusser is interested in the way that Machiavelli is engaged in what Althusser calls a constant toing and froing with the past, that exemplarity and analogy is really central to the way Machiavelli thinks. He's always leaping backward in time. So it's not progressive or historicist, but it's also not the case, and this is leaping ahead to the void, it's not the case that action in the moment is utterly torn from anything in history that might inform it. There are all these examples. So I'd love to hear how you think about analogy and exemplarity in relation to action in the void and in the conjuncture. Just to bring force and conjuncture together very briefly, I was really struck by the way you do that. You write, the perspective of conflict of forces as a singular case is the perspective of political action. So that's the perspective that Machiavelli brings, is the idea that the conjuncture is a conjuncture in which certain forces need to be brought together. the form under which to rally the forces at disposal, I think is the way you put it. I want to ask on conjuncture about Althusser's insistence that the task of Machiavelli's conjuncture was the formation of a national state. Mm-hmm. First, there's something maybe anachronistic about calling it a national state in the 15th, 16th century, and it may be that Althusser is channeling Gramsci's reading of Machiavelli there. But the other feature of that argument that Machiavelli's task is the creation of a national state that really struck me in Althusser's reading of him is that he's very attentive to the broader context of the political conjuncture of Machiavelli, the international context. That the reason that that's the task for Machiavelli, he says, is because other states in the world that Machiavelli inhabits have already done that. Spain and France have already created absolutist national states. Italy hasn't yet. That's why that's the task that Italy faces. And so I wonder how you might think about the place of this broader context in a given political conjuncture. On Althusser's reading of Machiavelli, arguably the international context is fairly fixed. Other national states exist, and they form a kind of recalcitrant background against which the prince has to act. In our own moment, and in relation to what you call the creativity and liberatory forces of collective political discovery, which I love, where each kind of moving from the individual acting prince to the collective actor, the global context is surely less fixed and more open to incorporation within those very collective political forces. It's not it's simply a recalcitrant backdrop. And yet, might it also make sense to treat some features of the broader context as intractable or as beyond the scope of a given political effort? So how do you think about that conjuncture in its broader international space? And then third, on the void. So this names the idea that what is demanded in the conjuncture is something utterly new. As you write, Machiavelli calls for a beginning as a blank space, a rejection of all extant solutions and all positive forces as possibilities. And here you emphasize the limited but still valuable role for theory. This is another phrase that I love. I keep quoting Osern because I think there are many really beautiful formulations. Knowledge can't create a new present, but it can help open the space for it. And so on this last point, I'd love to hear you say more about the import of Althusser's concept of the aleatory, which again, you've mentioned a little bit, but haven't said too much about. And I was thinking about the etymology of the term aleatory in the Latin for dice, and thinking that image could go in two somewhat different directions. I don't think they're contradictory, but they have slightly different import. One kind of as mere chance, and the other as a kind of wager, throwing of the dice. So there's aleatory in this, I was thinking in the sense of aleatory music, where composers throw dice and then they write music based on what the dice tell them, or they put staff lines on fish tanks and play the music that the fish swim. That's utter chance. And then there's, in contrast, the idea of alia jacta est, the Caesar crossing the Rubicon and throwing the dice, and there's, in that sense, a kind of encounter of virtu and fortuna, where it's not mere chance, but some kind of interaction between chance and an engaged actor. And so I'm curious how you think about that, and that brings us back to the question of the figure of the prince as the agent of politics. So how do you think about something analogous as enacted by a collective? What is this? How do you think about the collective political inventiveness, the qualities that make that kind of collective political inventiveness possible seem on the face of it very different from the kinds of qualities that Machiavelli attributes to the prince and that Althusser engages in his discussion of Machiavelli. And Althusser is interested in the solitude of the new prince and the solitude of Machiavelli in his relation to the new prince. And so in certain ways, the prince seems like quite an unpropitious character to serve as an analogy for, or an exemplar for, what you call mass creativity. So this is, in a way, to return to my question about the new prince. I think that's all. And you mentioned Spinoza a few times, and so I'd love to just hear. I don't have a specific question about Spinoza, but it seems like it forms an important background. So if you want to work any thoughts on Spinoza into your conversation, or maybe somebody will have a more specific question about Spinoza. We can take it up.
Thank you for these beautiful questions. Should I just begin by attempting to answer all of them? There's really a lot.
Or, yeah, why don't you say just a little bit, and then we should maybe
Well,
open it up to
Althusser's reading of Machiavelli is first and foremost very much indebted to and oriented by Gramsci's reading of Machiavelli. And Gramsci's Machiavelli is quite a central theme in Quaderni di Carcere, in the prison notebooks, in as much as he names his own project, which under the censorship of the prison he calls a philosophy of praxis. He names it as the New Prince. And the New Prince is basically the question of revolutionary organization. The New Prince is the very question of Marxism as such, as the site of the fusion of theory and practice, as the site of political organization as such, which articulates theoretical investigation and militant work, militant engagement as such. So in a certain sense, we're already displaced here, even if, of course, the entire question brought about very, very correctly by Jennifer, the prince is a subject, the prince is a leader, the question of leadership, the question of the relationship between the prince and the people, the question of political representation. Precisely, this is central here, in as much. Then you get this strange echo. The question of political representation is crucial, and one aspect of Marxism and specifically of Leninism can specifically be vulgarized in terms of an excess of representation. It is the masses are represented by parties, the parties are represented by cadres and or militants, and the militants are represented by their leaders. But I think Althusser invites us to think beyond this, to think precisely, well, the conceptual shifts are in fact quite complicated, in as much as we shift to a large degree from representation to something which we can call presentation. Why do we shift from representation to presentation? Well, first because in Althusser's own understanding of what knowledge is, of how theory treats or how theory addresses history or society or social circumstances and trends, there is an insistence upon, and this is the complexity of his endeavor, and this is something precisely which introduces Spinoza in a rather brutal sense. There is a necessity of a break with experience. Knowledge stems from a break with experience, which means that theory is not intimately dialectically fused with practice in the sense of being its direct result. There's no subject-object dialectic in a classical sense. Knowledge is only possible as a certain immanent movement, as a certain immanent production of the concept or production of content as such, which is only possible through a break with representation, through a break with the empirical understanding of what the situation is or what society is, through basically a certain playfulness with forms and with a certain formal understanding of concepts. The shifts are rather complicated, and I'm not going to elaborate on them here, but let's just put it that for Althusser, knowledge, as it is for Spinoza, for Althusser, knowledge implies the idea that the concrete is reachable precisely with an excess of the synthetic or of the formal. The concept doesn't capture the concrete of the empirical situation in its singularity, the thing out there. It doesn't capture it by, embracing the richness of what it is in itself, but in fact it constructs its own content by the progressive increase of something which Martial Guéroult, in his reading of Spinoza, called a generative synthesis, which means certain understanding of the movement of conceptual articulation, where you have a certain theoretical whole or a certain theoretical horizon, where the sense and the meaning of concepts is precisely so formal that they make sense only in the concrete interrelations or interarticulations that they have within what Bachelard would call a problématique, a theoretical horizon as such. And this is Althusser's wager. Only by creating ever more complex theoretical bundles, conceptual articulations, certain integrative articulation of different concepts, do we actually grasp the singular. The more formal concepts are, the more singular objects they construct. So already here there's a shift in the understanding of knowledge. There's a shift from presentation to representation, because knowledge doesn't really represent an object out there, but it constructs its own object as a break with experience. And of course, one important political intuition behind all this is Althusser's wholesale, in the sense he does follow Lenin very concretely, wholesale rejection of the spontaneity of revolt, the insistence that politics is either organized or is this doomed to fail, and it is organized if it includes a certain element of the theoretical as a break with experience, with the immediacy of experience as such. Where to go from here? Sure. But I mean, I can. No, but let me see where. And in this sense, to return, perhaps to take up what you said about the voids and the aleatory as the two aspects to. Because I need to link this back to the entire. This was Althusser's Leninism. This is his Spinoza. This is what Althusser attempts to do to Lenin via Spinoza. But everything falls apart. It starts falling apart around 1966, 1967, but it completely falls apart in the late 1970s when he writes these texts. And it basically, everything revolves around Althusser's consciousness of the collapse of this idea of organization, of the collapse of this very idea of the articulation of knowledge and politics. And there's some interesting symptoms which point to this collapse. For instance, already in 1967, Althusser would write something very strangely in some text where he would say that political practice often produces theoretical concepts which are far ahead of the current state of theory. And this is very paradoxical in terms of this entire attempt to separate the concept from experience, to separate the theoretical as a certain separate construction of the content from the practical, from the experiential as such. What does it mean that the political practice, and he literally names new definitions of the party line, new types of articulations of the relationship between organization and mass inventiveness, new definitions of strategy and tactics. This, he says, produces a theoretical concept far ahead of the current state of theory. He's trying to still think within what I would call Althusser's proper depth to Hegel, which he never could get rid of, perhaps up until this point, a certain dialecticity of the relationship between subject and object. And this is the relation between knowledge and action, understanding action as something which is still intimately bound to the concept, as an extension of the concept, as a realization of the concept, as something coming from the dialectic of fusion as such. But here, in a certain sense, we have a reversal. Political practice itself produces a theoretical element, of course, without actually thinking theoretically, making practical moves. But this is paradoxical. And Althusser starts thinking beyond that as he starts thinking about the crisis of the party form. And the text about Machiavelli is precisely articulated around the time where he announces this crisis, at large, and which precisely concerns the question of the broader context that you pointed out. Because of course we know that Althusser had acted as a militant within the French Communist Party, but the implications are global, because they literally concern the fate of the Revolutionary Party as a form. Most of his interventions, of course, at the surface level, were interventions around a certain tendency in the French Communist Party to move away from revolutionary principles, to, for instance, replace the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat with the idea of a socialism with a human face, so certain embrace of liberal democracy in its many different principles. And one, at face value, one of Althusser's tasks, it was to return to principles themselves. But he also starts realizing something further, which is precisely something which is informed by his exposure to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which is the collapse, the imminent exhaustion of the party form as such, and the necessity to think something beyond the party form as such. And I would wager that this is precisely a point where it is necessary to think about an articulation between knowledge, between theoretical grasp, between theoretical critique, and mass inventiveness, considered as something which is always excessive to moments of organization, as a certain collective political capacity, which as such is unforeseeable, as something a certain collective political capacity which cannot be determined in advance, a certain collective political capacity which is necessarily excessive to the concept. And this brings us to, interestingly, to the question of solitude, the solitude of the prince. I would link it to this idea of immanence that I mentioned in passing by referring to Badiou. The rule of immanence is Althusser's fundamental intuition for politics. It is more important to rely on one's own strength than on the force of the circumstances or the force of the adversary, because the perspective is quite interesting, and it is a Spinoza's perspective. It takes us back. To properly unpack it, we would need to understand what Spinoza means by conatus in the end, or the specific relationship between the infinitude and finiteness in Spinoza's system, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to say that perhaps to understand it properly, we need to think about what might Althusser think about with an idea that a concept as such is something which is actual. What is the actuality of the concept? In which sense can a concept be actual? And what is the relationship between the actuality of the concept and the actuality of an act? And there is a certain parallel between let's say, a certain Hegel and a certain Spinoza here, because the actuality of the concept is, in a certain sense, its capacity of being active. So it is the activity of the concept itself. And a concept is active in Hegel as it is in Spinoza if it is immanent. The more the movement of the concept is immanent, the more it is not dependent on any externality, the more it can be basically collapsed within itself, the more it can generate its own internal necessity, the more actual it is. The difference, of course, being that the actuality of the concept in Hegel is its actualization. And it's actualization as a certain retroaction. Whereas in Spinoza, the idea, this is what Althusser takes from him, the idea is of something which is open-ended. The opposition is precisely a certain, this is why things get non-dialectical. The opposition is the opposition between affirmation as such, and incessant affirmation, the expression of the infinitude of the substance, and limitation, limits. And limit is something non-dialectical in Spinoza. When we think about limits in Spinoza, we precisely can think about what Althusser means by ideological interpellation. The reason why many interpreters have been on the wrong path by claiming that Althusser doesn't have a concept of the subject because everything is ideological, the ideological subject is interpolated in advance. Well, they miss the point, because the figure of interpolation is a concept of a limit to a process. And it's interesting that this very, you know, that he uses the Lacanian and Freudian metaphor of the mirror relation. And this is where, in fact, one needs to abandon something of Freud and of Lacan to get what Althusser is really about, because it's a Spinozist concept. The mirroring is, in fact, an idea of limitation. How? Well, you have a limitation whenever you have, let's say, in a process of knowledge, where you have a teleology, you have a fixed goal, or where you have a ground, where you have a fixed starting point, or where you have a fixed method. So whenever a process is reduced to a mirroring of presuppositions into results, you have a certain closure, you have a certain mirroring, and you have the breakage. You have a limitation. You have a breakage of the capacity of the process to create itself in its own immanent necessity, in its continuity. A quite crucial thing for Spinoza is continuity, as against the limited, discontinuous, partial understanding of what perception is, and so on. And I think this is Althusser's fundamental intuition concerning politics. We need to grasp something, we need to have a certain understanding of rationality also, or of capacity, which has to be conceived in its immanence. And the difficult thing is that he also would say in its necessity, as a deployment of something continuous. I would also wager something provocative. I would say that this comes very close to what Badiou means by the generic.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
But yeah, can I stop here?
That's great. I mean, can I?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is about precisely this. I mean, because for Badiou, politics is a kind of it has to do with the infinite, right? There's an infinite procedure. So kind of it seems to be a completely different. I mean, when the insistence on the finite here is, I wanted to ask just about this. I mean, would it be in Badiousian term? I mean, is it too quick to kind of fix Althusser with Badiou here?
It's too quick,
yeah.
Precisely because Althusser still sticks with objectivity. He still wants to have a theory of history. He still wants to have a theory of society. But at the same time, he attempts to affirm a certain idea of political capacity, of mass collective political capacity, which is unsituable within the theoretical horizon as such. Politics is literally something that he always thinks about, but he cannot situate it. But I think if one follows the Spinozist intuition behind this, then one actually comes very close to Badiou. Although the difference would be that in Althusser the overarching category is necessity. Whereas in Badiou it is not. So, but this gets us very
Yes.
far away.
Until what time are we going?
Maybe we do a 15-minute break, during which unfortunately we have no coffee provided, but try and clap or something to get people. Yeah, okay.
So we have about 20 minutes.
We can take another 20 minutes discussion here. Yeah.
Do you want to take your own questions?
Please.
There's a side button where you insist for the sake of recording. Press
the on-off button.
Okay, sorry. So thanks, Osrin. Yes, so just to go back to at the beginning, one of the things that Althusser kind of, praises in Machiavelli is that he's a thinker of political defeat without renegacy. We can think of conditions of defeat without reneging or abjuring a kind of an emancipatory political project, okay? And then, in your account, Althusser thinks that there's the snapping of the fusion of theory and praxis, which is kind of essential to kind of a certain Marxian or classical kind of Marxian politics, has made, forces us to kind of to reconsider, to re-articulate knowledge and, collective political capacity. This whole problem is, in other words, it's a snapping of the classical articulation of Marxist theory and praxis that forces us to kind of to find an alternative articulation, and hence the interest in contingency and so on. But a couple of things here is that this snapping, it's historically specific, okay? In other words, that the conditions under which a certain classical Marxian articulation of theory and praxis becomes untenable or incredible, it's a post-war, it happens with, the pacification of the European working class, in the wake of the First World War, the capitalist recapture of post-colonial states, and the co-opting of social movements about sex, gender, and race, okay? So from 1945 to 1975, these three kinds of modes of emancipatory politics don't seem to be they no longer have a revolutionary kind of optic, okay? The abolition of capitalism is no longer a concern of the European working class. Post-colonial states are kind of economically reinscribed within global capitalism, and social movements become commodified and captured by liberalism, okay? So in this sense, is the claim, is this crisis, is this really a disarticulation of the critique of political economy and communist politics, or is it really about the crisis of the Leninist party? In other words, it seems to me that kind of Althusser's diagnosis is overdetermined by his investment in Leninist vanguard, a certain kind of Leninist conception of the vanguardist party, okay? And as you said, it's the crisis of the party form that seems to be kind of, indirectly implicated in the kind of, the co-opting or the neutralization of these three vectors of emancipatory politics, okay? But then the question of communist organization, of the organization of communist politics without the party form, has been an issue for 40 or 50 years, okay? And in that regard, you retain, it's the critique of political economy, the analysis of social being, and of the primacy of, capitalist kind of institutions and forms as nodes of oppression, remains essential and to any kind of, emancipatory political organization, okay? And for instance, and in fact there are, Marxists have written analyses explaining the three kind of, why these three kinds of vectors of emancipatory politics were kind of neutralized and co-opted using the optic of political economy. And for instance, that's, the kind of again, the falling rate of profit, the reduction of the productivity of labor, the growing ratio of unproductive to productive labor means that there are more people employed in circulation and service than in commodity production, so that capitalism is kind of reallocating capital and trying to the growing significance of financial capital is that you have to try to kind of squeeze profits out of places other than production than direct commodity production, okay? So like the direct exploitation of productive labor is supplanted by the indirect exploitation of circulatory and service labor, okay? So then that analysis of social being gives you, so then the problem is, if this is the problem, so now we see struggles in the level of circulation and service, okay? And this is, so in other words, the class struggle has been reconfigured. The factory is no longer the kind of the primary site of class struggle, okay? And with the problem of decolonization, perhaps we can, there's in a way, what's happened is that kind of decolonization falters, as Fanon had already noted in Wretched of the Earth. If you try to decolonize without economic kind of, independence, okay? If you don't tie decolonization to anti-capitalist kind of policies. So all of this to say is that what happens if you decouple kind of, communist or kind of communist politics from the critique of political economy, from the Marxian analysis of social being, don't you get a re-philosophization of politics, which is very abstract, and then the danger is that the focus on contingency. I mean, the word contingency is doing a lot of work in this Althusserian analysis, because even for Hegel, contingency is not the opposite of necessity. I mean, they're directly proportional. The more necessity, the more contingency there is. So even the opposition of necessity and contingency, the claim that theory can only kind of conceptualize kind of historical necessity and can only give you a kind of deterministic kind of authoritarian kind of vanguardist politics, is also peculiarly, unconvincing, okay? So my question would be, hasn't he just kind of, isn't his whole diagnosis based on, too quickly, on his own, projecting from his own kind of.
This was brilliant, and it helps me to respond to something that I left out from Jennifer's beautiful questions as such. And this is the question of the relationship between what you started off with, Machiavelli having this dimension of globality and at the same time attempting to seize the aleatory. I like the diagnosis and the periodization and the instances that you singled out, but you left something. And you in fact displaced at the same time something. You left something in as much as you claim that, okay, Marxism as a theoretical apparatus, of course, is capable more than ever of responding to the crisis and theoretically grasping the crisis of the present. And of course, we can identify from specific Marxist concepts of today, we can identify points of struggles, new struggles, which have been redefined and reshaped in relationship to the three trajectories that you pointed out in terms of post-colonialism, in terms of different new social movements, and in terms of the pacification of the working class itself. But you leave something out which Althusser starts from. And this is the fact that the fusion as such is a couplet. Marxism is not simply a theoretical tool. It is something which is fused with the movement as such. And what is absent, I mean, the absence that he speaks of when he says something is snapped is the absence of a certain global sense of a movement. The sense that we can call the movement at large, in its globality, a workers' movement, which has significance beyond all concrete national conjunctures themselves. And this is the sense of globality that Althusser attempts to address, and this is the sense of globality which is behind the very dialectic of fusion. So, and of course, this does concern the party form, but in as much as the movement has precisely been conditioned by the different developments of the party form as such. But the diagnosis then it gets more difficult, because it is a question of within the very dialectical setting, it's something that Althusser actually never abandons, as it is central for Marx, as it is central for Lenin, it is also central for Althusser himself. And this is that the global sense of movement, in a certain sense, is directed towards something. And this is towards the end of the state, something that was brought up yesterday by someone here from the audience. The question of the end of the state is a central question. The state is the fundamental, it's not simply overcoming capitalism, but destroying the state, ending the state as the fundamental limitation of human existence. And this is a central question around which Althusser articulates his diagnosis, because it is about the fate of the very dialectic of the end of the state, the fate of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think his diagnosis comes not simply from the fact that the European working class has been pacified. It was already pacified at the time of Gramsci. Gramsci himself attempted to make a revolution against capital, the book, not capital, the social reality. It is the fact that the party form cannot anymore dialecticize the process of the end of the state. And this is something which was informed, I think, by the Cultural Revolution as such. That something has snapped in the articulation between the party and the masses in the question of dual power. In fact, something has snapped within the very unfolding of the realities of really existing socialisms in their plurality. That the party form as such has been exhausted and superseded. We need to think beyond it. And of course, it plays out very differently in different contexts. It plays out very differently in Europe as it does play out in China, or it plays out very differently in the center as it does in the peripheries or in the colonies as such. So I think this is the horizon of generality that Althusser attempts to think. What about the dialectic of the state, and what about the dialectic of the end of the state? Is this still a general horizon under which we can articulate Marxian principles? And is the party still the vanguard in this? And I think what I'm trying to do here in my reconstruction of Machiavelli and his diagnosis of crisis of Marxism is to say that Althusser has reinvented a certain Marxism of the rear guard, of the arrière-garde. So from a vanguard, we move to a rear guard. Because it is not anymore that the concept leads, that the concept as the determination of objectivity, the critique, and so on, is something which can provides a realization in the sense of an orientation that it has purchased, as in the English you would like to say. I love these words, have purchased something. Capitalism has infested this, that it has purchased on the reel of political movements. But it is about letting go or of catching something of mass creativity. And again, the diagnosis literally is global with regards to the question of the end of the state. Is there something creative in mass inventions globally that precisely can be articulated with a specific organized form, with a specific form of knowledge, through which we can continue thinking within the general horizon of the revolution, and at the same time within the general horizon of the end of the state? Because I don't think it's easy, as Badiou would say nowadays, that it's such a large problem, the end of the state, that it's difficult to think it. One needs to think at the distance from the state. But Althusser thinks still within the horizon of the end of the state, and I think this is something important for today.
We have 5 minutes, yeah?
Okay, thanks so much. This was very rich to think with, and I'm going to follow up, I think, on Ray, but going back to Jennifer and thinking about the figure of the prince. So I really understand and sympathize with the the disenchantment with the party form. But it does seem to be kind of a peculiar move to then go back to the prince, particularly Machiavelli's prince. And I like you, hate the vulgar readings of Machiavelli, so we're not there. Nonetheless, there is that kind of charismatic figure of the prince, and where he could have done more Althusser with the discourses, for example, which would have given you more a sense of a kind of, power or charisma in a collectivity that isn't sort of folded into the party form. So I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about why not the discourses, why the prince, and is there a problem there?
That's a great question. Perhaps because it is important in politics, as it is in other situations, linguistic, to have recourse to names. Perhaps politics has to do, the inventiveness of politics has to do something with nomination, inventing new names for things, inventing new names for our political capacity. A fellow traveler of Alain Badiou, Sylvain Lazarus, has written an entire complex tractate on what he calls the anthropology of the name, anthropologie du nom, in order to attempt to grasp how we can think a certain immanent rationality of politics as the invention of names, which has to do with political prescriptions, a new naming of things, both in order to affirm our own political capacity, in order to draw lines of the adversary, the constantly shifting lines of the adversary, to transform the adversary from something which is limitless and indiscernible to something which we can measure and we can name, to map out what are we struggling against if we're struggling against capitalism at large. Where do we draw the distinction? How do we name that in the concrete situation as such? So I think in this sense, Althusser's remark that the prince, before being a subject, before being a point of a synthesis of an articulation of something heterogeneous, and I think you're on the right path by saying, why not discourse? Well, because we do need a certain point of unity, and he calls it a process without a subject, he says. And he says this is strategy. He says the prince, Machiavellian prince, basically is a strategy. But when we have a strategy, we have a certain sense of principles. We have a certain sense of the unity of a development as such. We don't simply have a heterogeneity or multiplicity of different discourses, but we do have a point where we can unify things. And I think Althusser's own wager is that this strategy is to be articulated through an encounter between contingent naming from collective inventiveness and some principles, some conceptual theoretical principles. We stick to rationality, we stick to necessity on the one hand, and we try to affirm in the here and now an unforeseeable capacity, which precisely cannot be yet theoretically articulated, but we don't affirm it as imagination, as a leap in imagination, but we affirm it as something in dialogue with rationality as such, but which cannot be dialecticized.
I think that brings us to time. So please join me here.